Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Greater Good podcast. On today's episode, we have someone very special with us, even more special because he studied with me at college. He's a multi-faceted entrepreneur, a creative writer, and a passionate photographer, and wonderful at storytelling. He's none other than a very close friend from St. Joseph's College of Commerce, Samuel Joshua John. Welcome, Samuel, to the third episode of the Greater Good podcast.
Thanks, Zaki. Very excited to be here.
Yes, it's a pleasure having you here. And Samuel is somebody who I have seen his growth firsthand. We would sit share the same classroom, go on the same breaks at Kanti Sweets and just look at the traffic passing by and observe life. And when you looked at Samuel, you knew there's something in him that he's going to do something very different from the others. And it's great to see you pursuing your passion of nature, wildlife, and everything that brings people closer to nature. And what's truly special about Samuel is that he didn't just leave the corporate world, he left it at the peak when he was at positions of leadership and still said, no, I think it's time to follow my heart and do what I truly love. So that's what makes it really special to have you, because people who leave things behind to do the greater good is always special, and that's how we get people on this particular podcast. So a quick brief about the Greater Good podcast before we start deep diving into the interview. At SmartQ, we believe in 4 foundational principles. One is great food, great people, great experiences, and the greater good. So while we have done a lot about the first 3 pillars of our principles, we have just started to scratch the surface of the Greater Good podcast. So having you and hearing from you would really add a lot of value to what we want to do, and hope we could contribute in some way through our social channels and spread the word about what you do. So welcome again, Samuel. We'll get started. So before we get started, if you could share a few notes about yourself, your background, and how it all came through, and then we'll go into a set of questions.
Oh, thank you. Very generous introduction, I must say. But like you said, I think we shared more memories sitting on those Kanti stairs than we did inside the classroom, which I think says something in itself. But in terms of a journey, I think you said when you saw me watching the traffic and all of us were there, you could see that I would go on to do great things. I had no idea. I don't think anyone really does. I will say that it's been a journey of a bunch of things, but I think there's also been a lot of serendipity to it. Right? You work hard, you do a whole bunch of things, but really sometimes things just, I will say I've been fortunate. I think that's carried me through the years. And I think recognizing opportunities and being grateful for them is just how you go about it.
No, absolutely. That's so true. Like at 18, 19, what do you know? Where do you going to end up? And then suddenly one fine day, you're sitting in your mother-in-law's garden, I guess. And
I am.
That's the story. That was the prompt, I guess, for you at some level or some layer. Maybe it happened before, or maybe that was the true changing moment. And somewhere on an Instagram post, I think I read that and asked you as well. So we all sit in different gardens. We've gone to Cubbon Park and we've gone here and there, and it didn't strike us. Why did it strike you so much that this is the journey and this is the thing? While you were at, different corporate positions, which were at high leadership positions and different entrepreneurial stints. So if you could talk us through that journey.
Yeah. So you hit the nail on the head with my mother-in-law's garden and my wife, who was then my partner in a non-conventional format. What happened was I was very deep in the 9 to 5. You can't call it a 9 to 5. It's more like a 7 to 9. And you're just sort of bashing at it, and you start to ask questions. You start to wonder where all of this is going. Plunges you into existential crisis. And I think I was telling Aisha the other day, what happens is when you have, I will admit, I had some kind of accelerated growth, whether that was my own doing or, like I said, serendipity. I had a great boss. All of those things moved into me moving a little faster than I would have expected.
Right.
Which also meant I hit midlife crisis a lot sooner than most people.
Yeah.
Which is why I started doing things like gardening.
Yeah.
Right. So I went over to my mother-in-law's place. I saw her garden. I was like, hey, this seems like a great thing to do. Now just starting to get into things like birding and stuff, just telling stuff apart. So I said, hey, you know what? I'm so stressed at work. Let me come back and grow a bunch of plants. And even in that, work followed me. I had an Excel sheet with all of the different plant species I have. I used to do leaf counts.
Oh, okay.
So it became that for me. So it was this very cathartic place that was giving me some kind of an escape after I came back from work. What I didn't realize back then was when you grow a garden, I mean, now this is all I go on talking about, but that time I didn't realize that when you're growing a garden, there are other things that will come. It's not just your plants and your flowers.
Yeah.
So I had some 52 odd species, I forget the number of plants all over the terrace at my parents' place. And yeah, sure enough, ants came, wasps came. All of these things started to assemble themselves, and I was like, okay, where's all of this going? I was worried, but not so worried. One day I came back from work, a little ticked off, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And as I was walking, there's this large frame that's holding the roof together, this thing. And I walk through it, and I'm covered in spider web.
Wow.
Right? So I did what any Bangalore city boy would do in that situation. I shrieked,
Ran around and
I ran straight into a room, looked for a shoe, checked if I had some spray or something like that. Yeah. I came back out, looked for the spider, and it was gone. I was like, wait, where did that spider go? So I went back in and, as you do, Google these things. I was like, where did the spider go? And all of those things. And so I started to ask myself these questions, and then spider was missing. I was like, that's strange. Came back the next night, that full web is in place. This time I walked with a torch, a learning curve. And you could see the same spider sitting there, this beautiful web, and I was like, wow. Look at that architecture, and it wasn't there yesterday and it's back today. Right. So how often does that happen? Then I found out that these spiders, every day at dawn, they take their web apart, and every day at dusk, they rebuild that web in about half an hour.
Every day.
Every day, right? These are nocturnal orb-weavers. Orb because round, and so they weave this gorgeous looking web, and that's what they hunt on. And during the day, because there are predators, the spider disappears. She eats up her entire web, and she's able to reproduce about 90% of that. Yes. So learning things like that, I was like, wow. And I'd never thought of a spider like that. So then every morning, part of midlife crisis, I was also doing yoga. So I got out, I'd put my mat, and I'd watch this spider take her entire web apart in like 15 minutes and go and hide in one little.
Crazy.
So watching her over time, spending time with all of the nature in that garden, slowly made me think about this space as a shared space. It wasn't that I can't go show that spider or the wasp that's coming to my garden the land deed that my grandfather got over there and say, boss, this is my property.
Please leave this place.
Because that's such a even then you start to really tease that construct apart and ask yourself, what does it really mean to own a space, right? And so how do you share that with non-human residents for your own benefit? Because here was this garden that was, and it was a garden only because of all of these things, right? Like those bees and those wasps were pollinating all of this. The spiders were keeping the herbivores in check. So it was an ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I could start to see this ecosystem evolve, and I realized that all of this exists because of all of these parts. It was greater than the sum of its parts, and I was just one of those parts. And that was a beautiful realization. I think that was the start of my journey into this space.
Got it. And this was all in your own garden, in your rooftop, or was it still in your mother-in-law's garden? Were you building that?
Oh no. So my little terrace garden with that is nothing compared to my mother-in-law's garden, which should be declared a national park in its own right. It's this lovely garden that she built.
Okay. So you took this to your rooftop and you built.
This was at home.
At home. Yeah. Okay. And you said 52 species you initially created. How did you learn about how to create? How did you figure YouTube or Google, whatever? Or was it, how did you get this knowledge to make these things happen?
Completely stochastic. So it would start with, obviously she gave me a couple of plants to take home. So that started. Then you go through some, again, processes. Now, if you ask me, I'll be like, hey, let's put native plants and endemics and all those things.
You've thrown a few jargons.
Back then, it was just like, wow, rose is very pretty. I'll get one rose.
Yeah.
That's how it started, if I'm being honest. But then rain lilies, you're like, wow, this is something I never thought about. You get some cacti. You just start, initially gardening, comes from a very colonial mindset of let me prettify this space.
Aesthetically, please.
That's the whole idea of a garden, right? Now, hopefully, those things are being redefined. But when I started, and for a while now, it'll be, people want just a pretty setting, right? Like a manicured form of nature that kind of does something for you.
Yeah.
So that's how it started, but it evolved, right? Like it also evolved because it was very cheap. Instead of going and buying plants, I'll be walking by a lake and I'll be like, hey, wow, that purple flower looks really pretty. So I'll like take a little clipping, go back home, and then I have ipomia growing around. So yeah, how it assembled itself is a very
Got it.
random sort of set.
You just started and it started taking shape as from looking at it as a pleasing thing, it became more technically driven, and then you wanted to experience it happen in front of your eyes.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So all this was happening while you were at the corporate world, you were working, and this was also, I'm sure, helping you therapeutically in a way to balance it out. So a lot of people generally don't see life beyond, say, corporate, or they're like, this is it and I don't have time. So how did you craft this time? How did you, create this 1 hour, 2 hours, or whatever you did after work? And how did it become a part? And at what point did you say, I have to do this full time and start the spiders and the sea? I think that's how you officially started, right? Like that's what it became about. So from balancing both worlds and then to knowing that, okay, this is going to be full time, evolve like we just spoke. How did that happen?
So it was a bunch of things, right? And it's evolution over maybe like 3 or 4 years. Yeah, roughly about 4 years. And that's the thing, these things happen slowly. They happen if you look at it as a 4-year thing, it looks continuous, but there are these sudden peaks and drops. Some of those that I can remember is in one of my earliest dates with my now wife, we were out and she studied wildlife biology. So I'd gone to her campus space and we were walking around. And me being me, I've never seen so much green in Bangalore because I never bothered to go to these spaces.
Yeah.
And I was looking around and I was like, wow, this place must be snake infested. She gave me a look and she was like, snake inhabited. Snake inhabited. I just want to do that to the camera. And then so I was like, wow, wait, I never thought of it that way, right? Like infested versus inhabited is
big difference.
two very different things. So then I said, so subtle mind shifts like that.
Yeah.
So it was that, then coming back and of course you're working in a space, and I come from a fairly middle class socio-economic background, right? So you don't grow up like asking yourself, what do you want to do? You grow up saying, boss, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to get some money and, get through life. So none of these things had occurred to me. And I started to see that, okay, there are careers in wildlife. But even that wasn't easy, because even now when you talk to someone, they're like, you're going to do this for your passion. There's no money there.
Correct.
Which is a later part of our discussion. So then I said, okay, you know what, and the other thing was I was very passionate about problem solving, which is what allowed me to thrive in the work I was doing at that point. And it's just something that I feel very, I feel good. It's what I enjoy doing with my time. So then I said, okay, how do I translate that into another space? So I started looking for opportunities. I started looking at different things. And at some point, this was when I was still consulting for another firm.
Right.
I had to touch down in Bangalore because of the business visa thing for about a week and then fly back. So when I come down, I was like, I have a week anyways. Go somewhere.
Yeah.
By now, like you said, I was already 1 foot there, 1 foot here, not knowing where to go. I was still firmly in the advertising space.
Correct.
But I now knew that there is all of this.
You're at the advertising space, but there's a whole new world also out there, and that's where you are at.
Yeah.
Got it.
But you're still terrified. I mean, I guess I have one toe in that space because you're like, what will I do there?
Correct.
Right? I'm in my 30s.
Correct.
If I now make the shift, where do I start? Who's going to hire me? No science background. And that's a very, I suppose, Indian thing, but generally across the world. Like if I had to do a master's in, say, wildlife biology to get into that space, there are maybe 2 universities in India that will allow me with a BBM.
Oh, okay.
The rest of that entire spectrum, that entire ecosystem of universities will require a science background.
Wow.
Which is fair, I suppose, because they don't want someone coming in and saying, actually, wait, what? Can you teach me that?
Correct.
Which I should have learned in a bachelor's course. So all of those things weigh in on you. Which is why when I went on that 1-week vacation, I met this other person who was also a management consultant who had quit his career, was now in the Nilgiris, working with indigenous communities, setting up ecotourism, but where it was run by the indigenous communities. Whatever was coming out of the business would go back to them.
Right.
And trying to find some way of building some kind of livelihood.
So you met him serendipitously again? Or?
Yeah, I was just there for a vacation, and then he was the person running the place. So I started talking to him about, all of these my usual thing kicked in, and I was like, hey, have you thought about your bottom line can be broadened a little bit. You need to think about
Business.
Yeah. So I started having those conversations. He said, this all sounds fantastic. Do you want to come here and do it? I laughed it off. I went back to Sydney. I was sitting there staring at the water at Bondi Beach. And I was like, yeah, this is no. So December of 2017, I think, I left. And Jan 12th, 2018, I was in the Nilgiris with a backpack.
Crazy.
And then
at the friend's place.
at his space, and then just never looked back.
Wow. Crazy.
Yeah.
So that at his place was like for how long? And
So when I moved there, the both of us decided to work together on a bunch of initiatives centered around the community. But it was also in this lovely space in the Nilgiris, just the most incredible forests I've ever seen. I was there for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Then we were thinking of continuing with some other things, or coffee business, or among other things that again go back to doing some kind of community work with small growers in that belt. But at that point, I was at a crossroads. On one side was this, on the other side was moving to the Andamans with my partner. So I picked the Andamans and I moved there. Yeah.
I have a question here at this point. When you went to the Nilgiris and you left the corporate world behind, at that point, I guess that was the tipping point to go to the Nilgiris, work there for 2 years. Like many people leave the corporate world to start up something which is financially driven, the motive of making profit. Even if it's 2 years of less income or no income, you have that vision in mind. But doing something nature driven, or being at these kind of farms or eco spaces, how you'd like to call it, how is that different? And as a feeling of fear, or a feeling of, at some point you feel like, does it make sense? Or were you immediately enthralled, like, this is it, I'm plunging in it? Or at different points, like the peaks and troughs happened there as well? How did you settle in those 2 years before moving to the Andaman? We'll come there next.
That's a great question. I think, and I'm sure different people have different experiences here. For me, for one, I'm not the kind of person, I lead a very, 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 very low-key life, right? Even when I was in that corporate space and everything, I'd probably spend like 10 or 20 grand a month, right? Tops, like if I went like absolutely nuts. I'd buy clothes once in 3 or 4 years, not because I'm being conscious, and it's just how I'm built.
How you are, yeah.
So when I made this shift, I had a cushion and built up some kind of savings, and I won't lie, without that it would have been a lot harder mentally.
Right.
Without that, getting into something else, you're always going to be asking that question. Hey, how, what happens if, and all of those things. Because of that cushion, and because I'm generally a frugal guy, when I made the shift, it wasn't drastically different. So making that move now just meant there was less coming in, but the same amount was going out, so it didn't really make a difference. So that I think made it a little easier for me. At some point, you do ask questions, right? Because more than the financial aspect of it, you come into a new space. You were in another space where you had a learning curve, and now you're doing stuff at a certain level because you've had an amount of learning.
Correct.
But here, now you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
So you start to ask yourself about how much impact am I actually making. You go through that journey, then even that goes as you would imagine, right?
Yeah.
You suddenly realize that, hey, what do I want? Then you ask yourself, do I want to be like, changing the world? Or am I okay changing perspectives, or, growing as a person one step at a time? And for me, that was the answer.
Yeah.
Then or now, I have no illusion about me doing stuff that is changing the world and making the world a better place or anything. I just enjoy learning. right? And this was the space for me to do that. Like, there is no better space than the natural world to go out and learn things and, ask questions, look for answers, discover more questions. That's what thrills me about this space.
No, it's great. I think the answer you gave is very practical and logical. When you have a runway built up, say for 2 years, you are at a zone of I can experiment with my life, but still not taking credit away from me. Also knowing that fact that incoming is not happening at that level and thing is still a hard step to take. So wonderful for you to take that journey and at that tipping point to invest yourself into this process of learning and growing as a person. So which brings me to the next question. After 2 years, you took the decision of moving to the Andaman. So what was all that about? Had you started Spiders in the Sea at that point? Or were you still exploring nature in the Andamans or sea life? Where was that journey and what happened there?
So, Spiders in the Sea at that point hadn't started at all. What had happened was I was in the Nilgiris looking at the Western Ghats and Chetna, I'm going to stop calling her a partner. Chetna was in the Andamans and she had done some research. Now she was working with a dive shop. She was helping them build out their education and conservation side of things. So the main driver for the decision was we both wanted to be in one space. So it either meant she comes to the Nilgiris or I go to the Andamans. For somebody who had already got that much trajectory already in her career, it made more sense for me to move. Having only had 2 years over here, so it was tough to leave the Nilgiris behind and the kind of bonds I had with the people that I was working there. But it was a decision that had to be made, and so that's what drove the decision. And what also drove the decision was living in the Andamans. It seemed like a fantastic place to spend in like whatever was going to be our future. So I moved there, and the dive shop that she worked with, Dive India, they were very kind to give me a little job to help them clean up their accounts.
Okay.
So that paid the bills.
Nice.
Again, so it's just about finding enough to, get by in some way, which was great because I was looking at these numbers and revenue models at a much larger scale. So here I was doing it for a dive shop.
Correct.
It didn't take as much time, which meant I had all of this other time to just swim in the sea, go look for spiders on an island. It was fantastic. It was a year of like pure, like doing whatever I wanted. But it was also a nice setup because it gave me perspectives about the ocean. I started to look at islands as ecosystems. There's a whole bunch of things that then just started popping up in my head. So that's what the entire Andaman stint was about. We were supposed to stick around there and continue working with the dive shop.
Right.
And so all of those plans were in place. We were very excited. And then the pandemic hit. So in fact, our first lockdown, we were on Havelock Island, which is not the worst place to be. Lockdown, I must say. It had its own challenges, and that's for another day. But we came back from the Andamans and
to Bangalore.
In June, I think, June or July. And at that point, we started to ask ourselves, hey, you know what, when do we go back? When does all of that get started again? And it looked like things would take a while to like really come back to normal, which gave us a lot of time to think. Just before this, with her in the Andamans and me in the Nilgiris, both of us were collecting a whole bunch of images of wildlife and nature and all of those things. So we said, hey, you know what, let's start like something like an Instagram page where we just share this stuff along with, a little bit of natural history just to share it with the world, get people looking at this stuff. That's when the name Spiders in the Sea came up. So it was initially just a space for us to share stuff online. But then we're like, hey, you know what, if this whole pandemic thing, we don't know where all of this is going. But what we do know is if we go back now, we're going to have to help rebuild something from scratch. Do we want to invest our time instead in building something of our own from the start? And so that's what Spiders in the Sea became. So we said, let's just dive into this.
How long were you at the Andamans for? Like, was it another year, 2 year stint? Or
just a little over a year.
So can you tell us a bit more about the Andamans, like in terms of nature? And I know you're DP on WhatsApp also, your deep sea exploration and so you would have got to experience the sea life down under. And then spiders, of course, your fascination. So what was like the breadth and depth of nature there, and was it primarily that you were looking out for spiders, and but I'm assuming a lot more than that was discovered on the journey of the Andamans.
So the thing about islands is they're fantastic little laboratories for evolution. Right? Like there's so much that just happens in that space. So you get to see some of those patterns, and then you get to go back and read about them. So for me, you knew some of this in theory going in because you read about it before you jump into it, or like the island biogeography is a very big thing. Got it. I was like, cool, let me get into that before I go there. So I read a lot, and then once you're there, right, it's a very different context. For one, seeing things you've never seen before.
Yeah.
Seeing birds that exist only on that island and nowhere else on the world.
Yeah.
Endemic species. All of that was fantastic, right? So going through that journey, but also realizing that a lot of people when they go to the Andamans, it's very like, wow, blue water.
Yeah.
Blue water is fantastic. Not taking away from that.
It's okay.
But it also has phenomenal forests. Just the most stunning evergreen forests that you'll ever see in these tiny little concentrated clusters, right? You also then come to something called the intertidal zone. So you come from the forest, you reach the intertidal zone. This is where during high tide it's completely aquatic.
It's completely aquatic.
Aquatic.
Okay.
It's covered with water. And as the tide recedes, the tide goes out, it's fully exposed to air.
Okay.
And this happens every 6 hours. So the things that live there are unique on a level that you won't even imagine.
Crazy.
Right? Because they're adapted to living this, exposed to air and completely underwater. Like there are spots on Havelock where you can go for a walk for about 1.5 kilometers
Yeah.
and come back. And in 6 hours, you can swim in like 6 feet of water on that same 1.5 kilometer line and come back. So seeing spaces like that is also ridiculously good.
Yeah.
And then there's the diving. And then you go to all of these different
You have the usual scuba diving and the snorkeling and all those activities.
Okay. So there are plenty of spots to snorkel around. There's some fantastic shallow reefs that you can just snorkel over. There are many dive sites. Like Havelock is ridiculously now commercial.
Oh, is it? So there's a lot of tourists always.
It's a lot. I think there is about by the time I got there, only there were some 42 dive shops across just Havelock Island.
Crazy.
And I think that number's grown. The volume has grown. Lots of people coming in, lots of people experiencing the island, but in a very limited way, I would say. You can see them. You can see 2,000 people showing up on the island, and all of them moving from there to Sunrise Beach at sunrise, Sunset Beach at sunset, go on their dive, eat at a bunch of restaurants, and leave.
Nice.
Which is okay, but I wished it's catch-22. On some level, you wish they would see more of the island. On some level, you're a little happy that some of those spaces are still not as commercialized yet. Right.
So after Andaman, you said you came back to Bangalore. There's a lockdown, and then you wanted to share with the community all that stuff you've seen at Andaman and perhaps other stuff that maybe at the Nilgiris and things you have discovered. So that was the beginning of the Spiders and the Sea, which became like a community building of sorts where you want to expose the audience to nature walks, workshops, and generally helping them connect with nature.
Correct.
And that's the greater good that you were pursuing in some angle, right?
Right.
So tell us about this journey. Like this started in which year, and what kind of impact have you guys managed to have on the community, just through education or them being part of your nature walks? Have you any specific routes that you have uncovered with them, and they have got to witness firsthand what you got to witness? And did you all even eventually go back to the Andaman with this group of people, or did you do stuff like that took a deep dive, not just with you and your partner Chetna, right, with a larger community who started joining you all on this trail of exploring?
Right. So when we started Spiders in the Sea, it was still the height of the pandemic. So what that meant was now we had this idea. And again, I wore my usual hat. I was like, let's start something nature-based and all of that. But I was like, we need revenue model. We need, sales target sheets. We need forecasting. We need all of those things. Otherwise, you're going to, you need to survive.
Old habits die hard, plus you need to survive.
Right. And so that's what I had said earlier, something that we'll return to later is this idea that if you're doing this stuff, you have to do it for passion. 100% do it for passion, right? Like there's no two ways about that. But there's no reason you shouldn't get paid.
Absolutely.
And so how do you build financial inclusion into this wildlife space? How do you value services so that people working in the space don't just do it for free?
Right.
Because then it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
And it's not fair on anyone.
True.
If someone's willing to pay me like unnecessary amounts of money to tell them where to put an ad on a mobile phone, why shouldn't I think about how much I should get paid when I'm helping this person see their city differently or understand ecosystems differently? So all of that factored into then saying, hey, you know what, we won't be an NGO. We're going to set this up as a commercial but social enterprise. Right? We're looking towards building, like you said, a better world even for us.
Yeah.
So then how do you start doing that in small bits, especially in the height of a pandemic? The answer, as Byju's also bet on, was online class. So what ended up happening was we started doing online classes. I started doing classes about spiders, which initially we were like, you know, will people sign up for a class about spiders? But we're like, that's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
If you're getting into a free market,
Yeah.
you have to put a service out there that people see value in and then pay you for that value. Then it's down to you to figure out how to market that.
Correct.
And so that's why you get paid, because you've taken that onus. So we started promoting these. Chetna used to do classes on the ocean. I would do stuff with spiders. And so that started to build, like you said, a community. And a community that was almost itching and saying, hey guys, you know, this online stuff is great, but when can we go?
When we can go, yeah.
So when that opened out, we started to structure weekend programs. We started to structure short getaways. But there was one place that we both of us had a lot of familiarity with, and that was Havelock Island. So we said, okay, how do we create that as an experience? Because like I said, a lot of people are going to this island, going pop, 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 and they've gone.
Yeah.
Even when you go to the ocean and you go diving, right? Like that's the beauty of the sea. It looks like this vast emptiness. This is blue. And then you dip your head in it and it's so biodiverse, it's ridiculous. So how do you get people to notice that? How do you get people to think about that stuff? So all of those then led to us crafting something called Forests to Sea, which was an Andaman-based program that we do. It was, I think, about 6 nights, 7 days sort of a thing. And we'd have these cohorts of about a maximum of 6 people. You don't want to do more than that because then you just
dilute the experience. And
then you might as well just, you know, hey, that's cellular jail and you're gone. So how do you have conversations? How do you have, because different people experience nature differently, right? Someone may look at the physics of it. Someone may look at the social injustice prevalent in a system. Right? How do you engage with all of those things? Because that's where the relationship is formed for that person. That's because when you say, I want to connect people in nature, you can't force the kind of connections that you have.
You have. Beautiful point, yeah.
They will have some way of connecting with nature. How do you nurture that?
Yeah.
And you can only do that with these small groups. So we started doing these to the Andamans. And to your question on some rough numbers, but we've taken, so there's the Andamans, there's this wonderful coral reef and just lovely ocean habitats around Thoothukudi, in Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu. We've taken people to the Western Ghats. So all in all, I think our outbound programs, we've had more than 150 people join us on these programs.
Nice.
Right? Weekend programs, I think again the numbers somewhere between 60 to 100. The other thing we do are urban nature walks, right? So we head out to places like Kaban Park or Lal Bagh, which are familiar spaces to people.
Correct.
They've probably gone there, played frisbee, looked at the lake and come back. But we immerse those people back in places that are familiar to them, but through natural history, cultural history, because all of these things are interwoven.
Correct.
Some social dialogue. All of those things, we've had more than 300 or 400 people join us on those. The other thing we started to do was we realized that nature education, right? Like in terms of these conversations are great.
Yeah.
But they also have immense value when taken to a school.
As a curriculum or something which can be interspersed in their studies.
Exactly. Right. And for most of what I've seen, and this is not a comprehensive statement. I'm sure there are some fantastic people doing other work. But by and large, the general pattern is nature education becomes very, hey, you know what, here's nature, and it becomes very biological.
Yeah.
And within that biological context also, it takes on a very slightly, it'll either go doom and gloom, where it's like, hey, you know, we're destroying nature, people are bad, all of those things, or it goes in the other direction where it becomes very preachy and starts becoming, don't do this, don't do that, do this.
Little veganism types.
Which is needed, I suppose. But there's so much else that can be achieved through nature education, right? Where some of these mindsets about preservation and things like that are byproducts. Rather than telling someone not to do something, have them form some kind of connection to nature, have them form their own abstractions, and then that will lead them to make decisions. Because you can't change mindsets.
Correct. You can show different lenses, and then one lens might eventually, you might connect through that specific lens.
You want them to reason why to do a certain thing or not to do a certain thing. You want to help them build that reason, not force it down there. So what our nature education started to do was, and by no means are we perfect, we're still evolving, we're still learning, we're still growing. But what we're trying to do is one, engage it differently in different contexts, right? Like in some schools, you want to have nature education as this. Hey, you know what? Here's how we can protect our spaces.
Correct.
What are the benefits of that? All of that. But in some other spaces, particularly with those less fortunate, nature education becomes a tool for mental health almost, right? It's a great way for especially kids from marginalized communities to, because they don't have access to green spaces like we do. They don't have access to playgrounds, they don't have access to a whole bunch of things, right? Like, so how do you then just use nature to somewhere like make some of that, I'm not going to say make it okay, but like how do you at least start to chip away at all of the injustices that sit on them? So we started to do classes with them, look at nature around them itself, how do they internalize that? But then we were like, okay, this is great, but how is it benefiting the child? So we started to look at ways in which nature education can augment what they need to do in their mainstream curriculum, right? Because it's great if I'm like, hey, you know what, this spider is called Plexippus petersi, and then that's as good as us learning, what is that, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Correct.
I'm pretty sure you're not using that in your marketing role right now.
Correct.
So what's the point of me doing that? So then, can we then say, hey, you know, we'll go out and look at leaves, but while we're looking at leaves, we learn about symmetry. We look at congruence. Can that help with this year's geometry curriculum? So making it a little more fun, taking nature and adding all of these other aspects to it that, you know, help them with that. And on that front, we've now, and I last updated this number maybe 6 or 7 months ago, but we worked with more than 500 students across the country.
And these were mostly in marginalized sections of the, or even the urban.
This is all across the entire spectrum.
Amazing, dude. That's like brilliant. Like having impact at the grassroots level is so significantly compound when they grow up and they start seeing it differently, and you're building change at the bottom level also, which is great. In terms of the curriculum and urban nature walks, that's something I want to check on. Like, how was those things? Like, I know, you know, people be taken to these trails which are unexplored, and obviously there would be that magical effect of, oh wow, this exists and they see it differently. But say a Lal Bagh Urban Park, we go there for walks and we are processing our own lives in those walks rather than absorbing what's around us. So what is your technique and to make them see different? I know you said cultural significance and historical significance, but are there other elements where you stand at a particular junction of the park or witness nature there as well? Or what is the, and from a curriculum point of view, I remember when we had EVS in school, that was a subject where you were just told this graded, every subject had out of 100, this you got grade A, B, C. It was treated only like a whatever, you know, you can get C, nobody cares, as long as you get a C, you write whatever you want. And even in Commerce College, we had it in our first year, I think, were mandatory posts with multiple choice EVS thing. No matter what you did, you got a C. Even if you really aced it, I think technically everyone was getting Cs.
Correct.
So, is that also a part of your agenda to make EVS as a subject be taken more seriously, even in your modern schools, which I think is needed, where there's so much beauty from just the basic conversation you've had now. So these two things, if you could just talk about.
Yeah. So on the nature walk side of things, right? It really, from what I've seen, it really boils down to helping people find some kind of search image. The thing is, like you said, when a lot of us are going walking, we're just walking, right? Forcing people to slow down a little bit. It helps when somebody comes on a program because then they're already in that mind space to say, okay, I'm going to listen to this guy.
Yeah.
But then the onus is on you to be interesting also. The thing is, when you're going on these walks, right? Like you said, there's a whole bunch of stuff around, but you're just going to go with your blinders on.
Correct.
One thing that helps, and this may be biased because of my own interests, is to slow down and look at the little things, right? That is when people have light bulb moments. When you're walking, say, in a space like Lal Bagh, which is just filled with people and, familiar things, let's say you see one red ant waltzing across, you're not going to think much of it. But then you stop, and this is where also knowing some of it helps, you stop and you see that it's a weaver ant. Then you'll notice that close by there's another trail. So then you follow the trail. Then you go to the trail, and these are arboreal ants. Then you follow them up, and then you ask the question, what are those big clusters of leaves that have been bundled up across these trees? So then you realize that the weaver ants build nests. They take leaves and they stitch them together using larval silk. It's a complex process. And a single, I think, weaver ant colony can be 1,500 square meters. All connected, all, sort of in some way responding to one queen or one set of queens, all working in unison. And to watch that is incredible, right, for anyone.
Yeah.
To see that kind of a mechanism just exist, that kind of a social system. Then you stop and you look at a tree bark. You'll see some of the weaver ants carrying up even a large beetle. So you see teamwork in action, right? And so these become fantastic spaces for having conversations with kids, having conversations for team building activities with a group of adults or corporates. And you see what kind of mentalities, what kind of strategies are involved. I can't say mentality. I like to say it, but scientifically many people will disagree with me. So then you have this thing moving up. Then you'll have some more ants waiting over there. Some of them will pick them up and go. You have antination. You have complex communication channels. While this is happening, there's some more ants coming and spraying some of them with formic acid and removing any infections they may have picked up while foraging, fungal infections and parasites. All of that, and you wouldn't have taken 2 steps, right?
Crazy.
And I think that's the key, right? So to know that these things exist in your city, that these processes exist, these systems exist, there are these creatures that you see every day.
Yeah.
So how do you see beauty in the mundane? Because a lot of us take it for granted.
Right.
Right. Just to slightly digress, I think 2 years ago, now 3 years ago, I was in Munsiari in Uttarakhand. I was on assignment to go get a bunch of pictures of some birds and write about them. So I was in a fairly remote part and I was looking for this bird called the Himalayan monal. Gorgeous looking bird. Kind of looks like a chicken dunked in a bucket of rainbows, because it's a pheasant of sorts. And so I, to find it, you go around asking people. So I went around and I was like, "Aapne yahan koi monal dekha?" Everyone said, "हाँ, हमारे घर के पास 4 है." So for me, it was this bird that I wanted to go see.
Right. For them, it's
just something that lives in their backyard, right? So then you ask the question, how much are you taking for granted that lives in your backyard right now?
Yeah.
So when you have that appreciation, that's what you want to rub off on people when you go on a walk in an urban space.
Yeah, it's like here, and it's time you take notice and appreciate where you live and what you have around you. That's very.
So we don't do a lot of those, undiscovered trails and stuff like that. We're happy to leave them undiscovered. The idea is that you go on a familiar trail and then you discover a bunch of stuff you didn't know.
That's only for the urban walks, or generally speaking?
Generally speaking, we like to stick to that to a great extent. Obviously, there are some considerations where you don't want to go to a place that's crowded with people.
Correct.
But by and large, otherwise, if there's a path, take it.
Because you already know that well enough also to educate, I guess. That's a bigger reason.
No, even if I go to a new space, I'd rather do that because I'd rather go to a human-modified, disturbed path then go disturb another path that's undisturbed.
Got it.
Because there's still a lot for me to see and learn here before I go and. So unless I have good reason to go and disturb that other space, I'm happy to stick to where I'm supposed to be in some senses. Yeah. And to your question on the curriculum and the education side of things, that's a much larger discussion, right? Because there are many nuances at a policy level and all of those things. I think NCRT is doing they're making efforts to make things like environmental sciences a little more inclusive, a little more diverse. But you have to understand that in a country like India, which is so diverse, it's still very hard to, fix. Now I'm sure there are lots of changes, right? But even then it's hard to solve. Simple example is, I don't know if you remember stuff like this, but when we were growing up, like let's say you have a math textbook.
Yeah.
Your math word problems are Tom had a pie.
Correct.
And he has to share it with 5 friends.
Correct.
Who the hell is Tom and what is a pie?
Exactly.
I'd never seen when I was a kid.
True.
But if it was something like, I don't know, Sita has a bowl of payasam.
Yeah.
And she needs to share it with her friend. Yeah. Then you're like, hey, I know what payasam is. Okay, yeah, you can. So, context also matters.
Yeah.
But how do you build context in a country as diverse as us, in a subject as nuanced as environmental education? If you're teaching, desert ecosystems in Kerala, it comes with certain layers. But when you're teaching forest stuff, it makes sense to contextualize it to the forests that are already around there.
Right.
But the forests of the Northeast look very different. So all of those things are there. I think they're doing what they can to fix that.
So you've seen improvements, basically, is what you're saying. You've seen intent is there and stuff.
So I don't have enough experience, expertise, any of that at that level.
Got it.
To really comment on it. But at the level that we're operating at, one thing that we can see is that your conversations, your material needs to be extremely adaptable to some kind of context, right? Because one, you have local context in that space,
right,
in that region.
Got it.
Then you have many other layers, right? Like socio-economical contexts also matter.
Yeah.
So how do you then structure it differently and have that messaging across?
Understood.
And then you can be a little more effective in what you're trying to do.
Well, that makes sense. I think that's a larger thing. The bodies involved, governing bodies, policies and stuff. But yeah, I'm sure some of the stuff you're doing, or maybe at some point you will contribute at a deeper level. At this point, I think we've covered quite a bit of topics. Wanted to understand from you, how is 2025 looking for the Spiders and the Sea, you and your partner Chetna? Like, what is the plan? What are the programs? And how do you all roll the communication out that where people can join in? Why I specifically say this is because at SmartQ, we also want to encourage people who are doing the greater good and have people join the community. We will, of course, roll this out on our LinkedIn follow, so at least the corporate crowd knows about these initiatives, and they are also hungry to explore some of these things. So if you could talk about your calendar, if you are aware of what's happening in the next 6 months, 3 months, and how do people get to know about your upcoming workshops and stuff like that. So I know you were supposed to be at Arunachal and you're not there, but where all is the team going to go and what's happening?
So this year, and I think therefore for the how we've sort of made some decisions, because we're fairly new, right? We're a pandemic baby, so it took us time to evolve what it is we do, how we do it, what works, what doesn't. And I think another very important aspect is, do we enjoy doing it? Because unless you're honest about that, you're not going to survive for very long. So, for example, the online classes have shaved themselves off since the pandemic is done. So now we've slowly sort of taken a back step on our outbound programs, where we go to these different spaces and do these different things. This is the first year we're not going to the Andamans, for example. So with that, we're sort of toning that down to focus on our education side of things a little more. For our nature walks, we still do them regularly, for which we put out messaging on Instagram, and we have a little WhatsApp broadcast group. Outside of that, if there are groups of say 6 or 8 people to a maximum of 10, then on request we do these walks as well.
Got it.
Again, in an urban setting. Outside of this, when we're doubling down on our education side of things, we're looking at working with private schools, and there it's a very straightforward commercial agreement. We have paid for our time. When we work with some of these, there are two fantastic schools that we work with. One is called the Parikrama Foundation, Parikrama Humanity Foundation. The other is called the Gubachi Learning Community.
Okay.
Both of these work with children from underrepresented communities, especially Gubachi, Parikrama, both do fantastic work.
Right.
So what we're doing is we're plugging in our nature-based learning with them through 6 to 7 months of the year. And to fund those classes, we raise CSR.
Okay.
So that's the plan moving forward as well.
Got it.
To strengthen some of those classes that we're doing, on our own through CSR, and then looking at building our footprint in the private school spaces.
Okay. So have you also got corporate opportunities where you have employees from a you have tied up with schools, you said, but have you tied up with say corporates who have people plan offsites or different experiences for the employees? Has that opened up for you guys?
So one thing I will say, and that's what, everything we've done has been serendipitous, right? And I don't know if this is luck or what it is, but there isn't a single thing we've pursued. It's sort of been
Coming to you guys.
moving in, and we've then rolled with whatever's happening. So from that perspective, we haven't actively pursued corporate spaces. There is one organization that is funding our Parikrama classes, and so as a gesture, we'd like to do stuff for them.
Okay.
Through the year.
Got it.
As a sort of thank you for funding our classes. So that is our current only corporate engagement. Otherwise, we haven't ventured too far into the corporates also. But if you guys are interested,
Yeah, this could be a serendipitous moment. You never know, through us or through what we put out in communication, and people get to know that, what you guys are doing. On the last closing note, Samuel, would like to know, how do you think the Indians at large or the metro city people are perceiving, nature, environment? Are people still in their little bubbles and shells of this is my life, I operate here, and in your own rooms and not seeing beyond? And or there's openings now because post the pandemic, people have a light bulb moment overall about life in general. We should be more outdoors, we should be exploring, because when you're locked down for the 3 months, all people wanted to do was go out. Last section wanted to go out and party, but I'm sure also it opened up, people wanted to experience life.
Right.
So where does it stand right now in terms of the audience and the community?
I can speak for Bangalore because we've been around here more than anywhere else. It's a very mixed crowd. There are some people who will take to it just like that. There are some people who will take their own time or are set in some mindsets that are just not going to change that quickly, right? And that's their own choice, that's their own journey. There are people who have no idea about any of this, then show up, and then it just takes one little spark, and there's something latent already sitting there. Yeah. So it is a mixed bag.
Yeah.
But what I found, and this now I'll speak from the experience of having interacted with all of these people, literally all of those people are not averse to nature. It's just a complete disconnection from having grown up in a city. And that's true for me as well, right?
Yeah.
If you have 20, 30, 40 years of just being so disconnected, right? Because you forget where your food comes from. You forget where your air comes from.
Yeah.
Because you just take it for granted.
Yeah.
How you perceive nature when your food comes from Swiggy Instamart is very different from how someone perceives food when they're the ones harvesting it. So that disconnect exists in the city, but there's still enough, it's there in people, right? So it just takes that conversation, it takes maybe a set of conversations, and you will see something go off, right? They may not then suddenly change their entire lifestyle, but they may start looking at birds differently.
Correct.
They may start looking at the spiders in their house differently. So it's there. That everyone's potential is just sitting inside for that. Yeah.
No, I mean, very interesting closing remarks. People, there's one conversation or two conversations that can really roll down into some effects. Hope this conversation we've had has some kind of a effect where people want to know more and want to reach out to you guys and experience nature or experience familiar places which have been all around them always and see it differently and, get involved in communities and nature and preservation and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So on that note, Samuel, would you like to share something with the audience that we haven't covered in our questions or, on closing notes from your end?
No, I think that's it. Just sharing from my own personal thing is because we're living in a world of flux in many ways, right? I think the one thing that is on short supply a little bit is empathy. And a great and everyone's capable of it. Everyone's probably exercising it, but it goes in different directions and it's a little dissipated, I found. And I think just spending enough time in nature for whoever gets to do that, to build empathy, right? To just say that, going back to the garden, it would have been easy for me to look at that spider as a pet and say, you're on my property.
Correct.
You're mine, whatever.
Start paying rent from tomorrow.
And so, I need some mosquitoes. So, how do you acknowledge interdependence? How do you acknowledge that, because that will flow to every point of your life. If you're able to respect a spider in your garden and say, I know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Then that will translate into how you interact with people at work.
Yeah.
How you interact with someone on the street. And how you see society at large.
Yeah.
I think, that is a nice takeaway.
That's beautifully said. In fact, just very recently, I got to know the exact definition of empathy versus sympathy. Sympathy is when you're sympathizing with the person, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." You're just passing comments. Whereas empathy is walking in the shoes of that person. Like in this case, walking in the shoes of people in nature, for example, actually going out and saying there. So hope, let me say this to the camera. Hope a lot of people walk in the shoes of nature so that you get to empathize with your surroundings and get to know what exactly is the construct of things that happen around you and know better people for you to join on this journey or go along with the founders of Spiders and the Sea, Samuel and Chetna. Samuel, thanks a lot for doing this with us. A really interesting conversation. I got to know a lot and we look forward to streaming this conversation down to our 100K plus followers on LinkedIn plus our Instagram and wherever we can, and also put in a word to the employees of SmartQ about your initiatives. And who knows, serendipitously, this could be another or a start of a corporate journey of people, coming through.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Samuel. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me and thanks for the conversation.
Absolutely. Pleasure's all ours. Cheers. Thank you so much.